It was up to the Tucson Police Department to quiet the violence and vandalism last weekend, while letting the protests continue. Tucson Police Chief Chris Magnus says the curfew put in place by the governor has helped.
I think the test will come in if we have larger protests where you have a small group that breaks off to cause trouble, particularly after dark. Usually most of this starts after 9 p.m. So I think we still have some tests ahead of us, but I think it's safe to say it has been helpful.
Whether or not the curfew was needed to cover all of the city of Tucson is something Mayor Regina Romero questions.
I don't think that an 8 p.m. curfew throughout the state was necessary. Here in Tucson, we have seen violence, and the chief of police was thinking of recommending a curfew for Tucson, but delegated to a certain area of the city.
The Tucson Police Department said the violence and vandalism associated with the Saturday night protest left about $200,000 worth of damage in downtown and along 4th Avenue. But that hasn't been the point of these events, as seen on Monday night when hundreds of people gathered at the Dunbar Pavilion for a vigil. Among them was Magnus, who says he was there to listen.
I heard the pain that people feel related to systemic racism, to contacts that that they've seen involving the police, not so much here in Tucson, but certainly in other places, particularly around the country, and the feeling of really being potentially a victim of police violence, and in some cases having already experienced that.
Romero also attended. Like the chief, she was there to listen and show her support.
It's absolutely necessary to make the voices heard of our African-American brothers and sisters throughout the nation, especially here in Tucson. That's what's important. Right now, politics doesn't play a role.
Magnus says he was disgusted by the video of George Floyd's killing. He says not only are TPD officers trained not to put their knees on the necks of people, he says other officers would not have stood by and let that happen.
We do more than train. It is in our policy. It is an absolute expectation. And it's incorporated into training as well. But it's something that we look for in any situation where we have to use force to make sure that that force is not excessive, or to make sure that officers are not going further than they need to go in terms of using the least amount of force necessary to make an arrest, for example, or handle a situation.
Magnus says Tucson police officers are all trained in first aid and expected to provide it if they cause harm by excessive force. The Tucson Police Department has a force review board that looks at complaints of excessive use of force.
We're always open to feedback. We're not perfect.
He says listening is essential to maintaining the public's trust in his force. Democrats in the state legislature are urging the governor to call a special session to look at reforming police practices. One thing the chief says needs a second look is qualified immunity. That's the legal doctrine that keeps police officers and other government officials from being sued for actions they take on the job. The U.S. Supreme Court is currently debating taking up a number of cases which could change how qualified immunity is administered to police officers.
I think some tweaks are appropriate. I think there's some reasons for qualified immunity which are more complex sometimes than the public understands. But I think that immunity and the use of that may have gone too far at this point.
Changes for minority communities are about more than just policing. It's about an overall attitude in the city.
We are also starting to work on an equity audit in the city of Tucson that Councilmember Santa Cruz is leading.
Before that work is finished or the memory of George Floyd fades, the city will have another racially charged issue to deal with. The U.S. Supreme Court decision before the end of the month on the future of DACA, when again protests could erupt and the police department's tactics could be tested.